You're listening to a download from the outdoorstation.co.uk. Number 575.
Hello and welcome back to the Outdoors Station. I'm your host, Bob Cartwright, and I've been producing self-powered outdoor-related content for podcast fans since 2005. Primarily it's been to share knowledge and information, plus to inspire those heading out on adventures of any nature to be better equipped and ultimately enjoy the journey more. Those of you who have dipped in and out of these podcasts over the last 20-odd years will have heard me talk many times about legends in the outdoors world who have pioneered many of the big changes in gear which we all benefit from today. However, those new to backpacking and camping generally will probably have never heard the names of Ray Jardine, Henry Shires, Glen Van Peski, Brian Vargo, even our own Chris Townsend and Graham Thompson. People whose experience and influence on design have A, opened our eyes and minds to enjoying outdoor life more through carrying less weight, and B, educating the manufacturing world to keep it simple, that less is in fact more. And my conversation today is with one of those legends, Glen Van Peski, founder of Gossamer Gear, one of this select club of key figures who helped educate us to start questioning everything the shops sold us, well, way back in the 90s. A little bit of history. When I started backpacking as a child back in the 70s, gear was still very much influenced by army surplus. Steel frames were used in rucksacks. Cooking gear was still aluminium-based mess tins and variations on it. And of course, you could get anything you liked clothing-wise as long as it came in green. In the 80s and 90s, aluminium frames were being used in rucksacks instead of steel, and gear started to be available in anything other than green. By the time the 90s came along, brands started to get influenced by new materials, adding more and more features and weight to products. Now, I mention this to give you some context for the conversation you're about to hear. What Glen and this small handful of pioneers did was coincide with getting the message out via this newfangled internet thingy out to the masses. So instead of slogging our guts out carrying heavy loads, we were educated to think that there might be other options. If you're new to backpacking and camping, you're probably still going through the same growing pains that we did back then. Carrying too much, getting hot and sweaty within 10 minutes of leaving the car, wondering what on earth you can get rid of, and ultimately not enjoying your adventure as much as you hoped. Which neatly brings me on to Glen's new book and the subject for this conversation, Take Less, Do More, Surprising Life Lessons in Generosity, Gratitude and Curiosity from an Ultralight Backpacker. Plus, if you keep listening right to the end, I've got 4 copies to give away.
The book is about, as I worked over the last, depending on how you count, half century to lighten my pack weight, I realized that some of those lessons that I was learning applied not just to backcountry, but to the rest of life. And so the book is taking those lessons that I learned from lightening my load and applying them, how I applied them to the rest of life.
Okay, so going back to the very beginning, obviously I must remind listeners that we've actually spoken a few times over the years, and so we're sort of fully aware of each other. But for people perhaps listening that are completely unaware of how the brand started, could you just give us a bit of an idea, a backstory that brings it up to date?
Sure. Well, I started sewing gear for myself. I mean, this is my mom was a firm believer that every kid should leave home knowing how to do three things: how to cook, how to bake, and how to sew. And so all three of us kids know how to do those and do them, to different degrees to this day. Um, and so this was back in the day when our oldest son, Brian, joined Boy Scouts, and I joined with him as an adult leader. My buddy Reed Miller read Ray Jardine's first book, the Pacific Crest Trail Hiker's Handbook, and he got all excited about that. Then I read it and started getting interested in lightening the load. We looked at these scouts when they come into Boy Scouts are young boys, and we're loading them up with these huge loads, and it just wasn't very enjoyable.
Just to help people, obviously this was what, late 90s?
Yeah, no, good for frame of reference. I forget to do that because it all kind of runs together at my age. Yeah, and so I sewed a pack. I figured when Brian and I were going on our first Sierra trek, it was like a week in Sierras, was backpacking Sierras was our troops, our Boy Scout troops kind of capstone experience. And so we went down to REI, and all the gear I had from my youth was gone, left back east. So we needed to kit up, and they definitely sold us everything. It was just they just come out with the new internal frame packs. And they said, "Oh, these things are great. They move with your body, yada yada yada." And that thing weighed 7.5 pounds empty, which I'm still not convinced that was the advancement over the old frame Kelty pack I had when I was in Boy Scouts. But anyway, it was the latest and greatest, so we bought it along with the stoves and the sleeping bags and tents and all that stuff. And my backpack was over 70 pounds loaded for a week in the Sierra, which I can say those words, but I can't even wrap my head around that now.
Just looking up as you mentioned that, just to give people a frame of reference in the UK, because obviously pounds is old money as we would call it.
Old money.
So a 7 pound rucksack is just over 3 kilos, and a 70. Good grief, you must have been fit in those days. 70 pounds was over 31 kilos. I've carried just over 20, and that almost killed me. So 31 kilos, outrageous.
Yeah, no, we have a picture in the book actually of Brian and I on that Sierra trek, and the huge pack is towering over our heads, and we just didn't know any better. But I started focusing on lightening my gear, and that 7.5 pound pack loomed large as probably the heaviest individual item. So I thought, well, let's see if I can do something about that. So I sewed a pack and hiked with that, and thought about improvements and sewed another pack. And about the fourth pack, things got to where, it was about a pound, which was a good advancement. And so I put the plans on the internet so other people could make the G4, as we called it, if they wanted to. And I kept getting calls from people saying, well, I don't know how to sew, and I don't know anyone that knows how to sew. So could you make me a pack? And I'm working 70 hours a week at engineering. It's like, no, I can't make you a pack. But I got enough inquiries that I thought, well, I should find if I could get a few packs made for people. And that was kind of the start of, early days GVP gear.
Yeah. Well, I remember having a G4 pack myself, so thank you very much for that. And to give people an idea, that's 453 grams. So to give you an idea of comparing that to a lot of packs you'll find in the high street now, you'd be looking well over a kilo. So yeah, it was an impressive pack, and it was a sil nylon. In fact, there you are, it's showing it there. That's wonderful.
There it is.
So it's a sil nylon pack with mesh pocket either side, deep pocket either side, and a large front pocket as well. And that was about it, wasn't it, really?
Pretty simple, pretty crude by today's standards, but yeah, I mean, that's why it only weighs a pound.
Absolutely. And it would carry what sort of weight comfortably?
25, say, 10 to 12 kilos, I would say.
Okay. I
had people that carried 14, 15 kilos in it, but I didn't find it comfortable, that kind of weight.
And just to give people, again, a sort of a perspective about the time scale here. Late 90s, early into the early 2000s. I read Ray Jardine's book as well, Beyond Backpacking, which I don't know, was that the first book recycled, or was that a fresh book?
It was a fresh book, a lot of the same material, obviously, but kind of more generalized compared to focused on the Pacific Crest Trail.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the book's still available now, and it's certainly a book if you're interested in making your life easier and carrying less. It will enable you to ask questions about everything that you carry, and this is obviously a philosophy that you followed, and continue to expand your ideas with Gossamer Gear when you're involved in designing the packs there.
Yeah, and I'm still involved in design. For example, our most recent tent at Gossamer Gear, the Whisper, was something that I designed for a bike packing trip. I was doing 1,000 miles, so 1,400 kilometers or something like that, on the Great Divide bikepacking mountain bike route. And I knew it was going to be buggy, so I needed something that had bug protection, but I wanted something lighter than existing tents. And so I made a number of prototypes in Tyvek and then moved to DCF and finally got something that I liked and used on that trip. And then that turned into the Whisper.
Oh, fantastic. Our last conversation was 11 years ago, and I must put the links to that conversation for people, because what seems to have changed for me is there's a whole new generation, or more than one generation, several generations that have sort of come into the outdoors generally, and they're all going through the same education process. They're all going to the nearest shop, or well, obviously a bit more online these days, buying perhaps gear which is affordable for their particular budget, and discovering that if they carry their fears and carry all their concerns with them, it's along the same lines as your £70 pack. It's not as heavy as that. I think people are probably realizing that once it hits 20 kilos, it's actually well beyond being too much. But there are people carrying an awful lot of stuff out. So have you found that the people that obviously didn't follow the early part of your journey, but sort of people in their, I don't know, late 20s, in their 20s now, coming to backpacking, there's a whole new generation that are unaware of the history of people like yourself that are sort of pioneered?
Yeah, to some extent. I think they are benefiting from some of the pioneering work, because the mainstream rucksacks and shelters and everything, the mainstream manufacturers, I think, were forced to go lighter by the early cottage manufacturers. But I think that people today probably have a problem that you and I didn't have. Kind of the opposite problem is too much information. There's so much out there now. You've got the internet and YouTube and blogs and everyone telling them, their personal take on ultralight. Once they are aware of it, probably the challenge for them is sifting through the information and finding what's going to work for them, compared to you and I were kind of making stuff and trying to hunt down the one person that was making the lightest cook set, and now there's 100 different options. So it's a different situation.
Yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head there. I mean, I think probably the Asian market, who manufacture presumably all the titanium that we use generally outdoors, they've really grabbed hold of it and maintained the ethos quite early on. And you're right. The mainstream manufacturers sort of, I think initially, probably 10, 15 years ago, gave it a nodding approach, thinking, well, make things a little bit lighter and they'll call it lightweight. And then they started to go back again. But now I think, perhaps no offense to your sewing skills there on the G4, but the design elements come into it now, isn't it? Things are having to look sexy as well as be particularly lighter.
No, that's true. I think some of the, certainly the G4 and many of the early cottage manufacturers, the products looked like they were put together by, no offense, engineers or, people hacking stuff in their garage. And it was the focus was on function, not really what it looked like. And so definitely, I think the lightweight gear has gotten more streamlined and, it looks a little nicer than the early products for sure.
Well, your book does certainly goes through goes through a whole range of experiences and education. The other thing that I think people have a problem with these days is because there is so much information, and they choose their particular influencer of choice who influences their particular ideas. They want to buy everything all in one go and then go heading out into the hills. And of course, I'm a firm believer, and I don't know if you are, but I think the slow progress of realizing what you do need and what you don't need takes a while. And I think buying it all off the shelf, you can put yourself into quite a dangerous situation if you're not careful, using lightweight gear straight off the shelf for the first time if you've not really had much in the way of camping experience.
No, I would definitely agree with that. We used to, in the Boy Scout troop, um, another scout leader and I used to do a Hans and Franz show where he would come with this huge big backpack, all filled up with, all this traditional stuff. And I would have my tiny backpack, and we'd go through a skit where, I'd say I was ready to go. And he'd say, that's impossible. And he'd pull something out and I'd pull something out. He'd pull something out and I'd pull something out. And, we could see it was a way of showing like I had everything covered just in a lighter way. And I had one parent come up after the skit and say, I want to buy everything you have in your pack. And it's like, no, that's not the way to do this. I always tell people, like, when you're, myself, I'm usually tweaking something. I'm trying something new out. And I tell people, try one, maximum of two new things per trip. Because you want to be slow to introduce variables that are going to impact you having a good experience. So, until you figure out if the latest titanium spoon is the one you want or not, go easy on trying out new stakes, new tent, new sleeping bag, and a new pack all at the same time.
Sure, sure. Having scanned through your book, I got hold of a copy yesterday, but the opening credits, I think, might take people by surprise when you have a comment there from Matthew McConaughey, the film staff actor. How did he get involved with going on a hike with you?
Well, he's not a friend of mine. He's a friend of a friend, but he graciously, gave me a blurb for the book. So a friend of mine is Dan Buettner, the Blue Zones guy. He's a super interesting guy, like world's most interesting guy, probably. He holds some Guinness World Records for cycling around the world or across Africa, and has a very interesting group of friends. And I met him through John Mackey, co-founder of Whole Foods Market and my business partner for Gossamer Gear, which is a whole nother story about how that happened. But so I have what I call the list. It's a list of people, probably about 60 or 70 at this point, that a couple times a year I will get permits for a trip and then send out a blind copy to the list for whoever can join me. And there's three criteria for being on the list. And I kind of stole this idea from John Mackey. And the first criteria is they have to be good company in the backcountry. So my shorthand for this is people that have something to say but nothing to prove. They're interesting people, but they're also interested people. They're people that are interested in the world around them and the people around them. They don't have to be the center of attention. And then the second criteria is that they've got their gear pretty well figured out, because I don't have the patience for taking, beginner out backpacking. That's not really my strong point. And they should be reasonably fit, because I tend to like to hike all day. So they're going to have more fun if they have some level of fitness. And the second two are somewhat negotiable depending on the trip and the final makeup. But the first one, the good company, is definitely non-negotiable. And so I do a couple trips a year usually, and a standard trip I do every year typically is Buckskin Gulch. It's the longest slot canyon, some say the world or US. I don't know. It's a long slot canyon. It's very beautiful. And it's nice to expose people to something amazing. I can provide trip intel. I have the permits, which are hard to get. And so they just need to show up. And So I invited Dan on a trip, and then he, called me a week later, said, "Hey, can I bring a friend?" It's like, okay, well, these trips usually fill up. And then a week later, oh, I got another friend that wants to go. So finally I just made it, Dan, this will be your trip. Invite all the friends that you can up to the number of permits I have. And Matthew McConaughey was one of his friends that wanted to go. So he was on a trip down Buckskin Gulch.
I'm sure he was fabulous company and had lots of stories to tell, but it's good to hear that he fitted your criteria. But my interest in mentioning him is, does he have a particular interest in the environment or the outdoors in particular?
He has an interest in adventures and new experiences. I wouldn't say he has a particular interest in backpacking or the outdoors or things like that. I mean, he's always up for adventure in life, and so I think that was probably why he said yes when Dan said, "Hey, you want to go hike down a slot canyon?" He hadn't done it, and it sounded like fun, and so yeah. And he was, I mean, as you can imagine, obviously a great storyteller, but he was interested in other people's stories too. So,
oh, good, as you say.
Yeah, it was funny. There were parts of the slot canyon where I ended up walking kind of behind him, and it's typically not crowded because it's limited permits. And but occasionally we'd pass someone, and you could see, like, I enjoyed watching their faces as they passed McConaughey and then came towards me, and their faces were like, "Gosh, that guy, he looked exactly like Matthew McConaughey, but couldn't be down in the middle of a slot canyon, right?" It's like, but wow, he sure looked exactly like him.
Yeah, I should imagine there were lots of moments where you were watching the people around you reacting to somebody like that in their presence, which must be quite a shock, really, in the middle of nowhere. So, but good fun. Yeah. And again, another good story to tell on your next trip, of course.
Excellent. Yeah, no, it was great. And we had lunch at a Cafe Rio, which is kind of a chain, fresh Mexican restaurant chain in Utah. And so we had lunch there before we headed into the canyon, and just, people looking at our table and going, "Man, that sounds like Matt, but be at a taco place in St. George, Utah." I was like, that doesn't compute. Yeah.
Excellent. Brilliant.
We hope you are enjoying this podcast. This is just a reminder, we have over 500 other interviews, stories, and audio diaries in our library, offering a wide range of self-powered outdoor-related topics. You can find a full list on all available networks, or via our website, theoutdoorstation.co.uk.
Coming back to the book, which is obviously available in all good bookstores and online, of course, let's actually touch on a few little practical things for people that are perhaps coming to it for the first time and have recently returned from a trip where they carried well over 20k, well getting towards the £70 mark. What are the sort of 3 or 4 things you suggest they do as a series of self-improvements as regards to make the trip more enjoyable, whether they're just sort of camping or going for a long walk?
Well, I recommend people first take out every individual item that they carried and weigh it, and then put it on a spreadsheet. And most people, when they do this, are struck by a couple things. One, they're struck by how many items they brought on the trip. And usually they're also struck by how you have a lot of items that individually don't seem to weigh very much, but when you add them all up, they're at 20K. So once you've done that, you could sort by weight and look at the heaviest items. I mean, that's what I did, and that's why I sewed a backpack for myself, because that was the heaviest item. So, typically for most people, the big 3 are going to be your backpack or rucksack, your sleeping bag, and your tent or shelter. And so those are areas, obviously, if you can trim the weight of those, that's a good place to start. And then I tell people, look at items that can do multiple uses. If you can eat with just a spoon, well, then you don't need a spoon and a fork, for instance. And simple things, if you can use something like a bandana, can be screen from sun and insects. It can be a pre-filter for your water. You can use a corner of it as a washcloth and the rest of it as a towel. So, if you really get creative, you can leave a lot of things behind just by taking a cotton bandana. And so there's plenty of other examples. I have a whole chapter in my book about specifically honing into kind of the backpacking. But, most people, the reason I think they pack too much are a couple. One is they haven't ever taken a look at all the individual items. And the other is, as you mentioned, people tend to pack their fears. I often say to people, show me your gear and I can tell you what went wrong on your last trip. If you have too heavy sleeping bags, or a big down jacket, it's like, okay, well, you were cold on your last trip. Or if they're packing too much food, well, maybe you were hungry on your last trip. So it's important to, develop criteria and numbers that will work for you. And that's through experimentation, a bit at a time, as we talked about earlier. And then start to hone down on the number of things you take through using multiple use items, and then the amount that you take. Don't take 8 ounces of sunscreen, which I don't know. If you're okay, do you bother with sunscreen? Don't take 8 ounces for a 3-day trip. Repackage things into smaller bottles.
And of course, I suppose on top of that, these days, everybody's taking extra weight in cables, adapters, and battery packs for technology. Technology's added an awful lot of weight, and I don't think people really consider as well.
That is true. I know I looked at some of my old gear lists, like probably from the era that you and I last talked, and I had a digital camera, and that was it. And those were pretty darn light. And actually, the phones are getting pretty amazing in the photography, but some of my favorite pictures are still ones taken on those old digital cameras. Knowing how to manage your technology can be very effective. I mean, I can get, through effective use of my iPhone, managing the battery, I can get 3 to 4 days without an extra battery pack. So that saves cables in the battery pack. So learning how to manage your technology definitely can save weight.
And I think it might be an age thing that shows the sort of age we are, but I remember going out without a mobile phone and anything else. It was just a compass and a map, and had a perfectly good time. So again, phones came along and everybody started carrying their fears about, well, what happens if? Well, usually when you're in a place where you've got yourself into the brown sticky stuff, the phone's actually not much good to you anyway because there's no signal. So go figure,
Yeah, and that's why it's good to have some, experience and knowledge and practice on actually being able to read a map in case your phone's like, I don't, I typically take my phone just for photos now, and maybe a little bit of note taking, although I still prefer pen and paper to that, because, I carry a couple sheets of Write in the Rain paper and a pen that works on that, because the advantage of that is if I need to leave a note for someone, I can't really do that on my phone, but I can write on a piece of paper and give that to someone to transmit information or to leave it at a rock pile or something like that. Typically the only thing I'm doing with my phone is taking pictures, which helps preserve the battery. But if you know how to use a map instead of relying on your phone for following a GPX route, something like that. And the advantage of maps is you get to see, if something happens and you need to change plans, if you've got a map, you can see the whole area. If you just have like your route on your phone, you don't know what your options are if you need to bail out, because all you have is the route that you plugged in. So
yeah, no, I totally agree. I've done quite a few trips in Scotland, and there's been occasion where stream might be in spate or whatever, and to actually see the bigger picture as opposed to using 2 fingers on a phone trying to zoom in and zoom out and try and work out where a sensible route would be. I find it very frustrating, and a map is certainly a great help. So, but again, it's it's a new generation coming through, and they've not really had much experience of maps, and they're seeing the phones or the technology as being the answer. So again, it's a conversation starter, certainly. So in your view, I mean, with your experience, what gives you the most pleasure then? Planning for a trip, undertaking the trip, recording the trip, looking back on it, or reflecting on it, achieving a goal when you get to the end?
Well, and some of those are tied together. So I think in the background, I don't know, you can see a sleeping bag and jacket. I've currently got gear strewn out because I'm leaving Thursday for 3 days in immigrant wilderness, and definitely planning the trip is I enjoy that. What gear am I going to take? I mean, at this point, my gear lists are usually pretty honed. But one thing I do is I pull up my notes from the last time I took a similar trip, either the same season or the same area, and review that for notes that I made on those little pieces of paper. Like, oh yeah, next time, take, like last time I went to immigrant wilderness, I didn't have gaiters. And, I didn't really need them, but there were some areas where it would have been nice to keep the gravel out of my shoes. And so, I have made a note, and this time I'll be taking gaiters. So, looking back on the trip is something that I try and do before I take the next trip, so that I learn it. I have taken trips and made the same mistake again when I look back at the notes, going, "Oh yeah, that's right. I learned this lesson last time, and I guess I just learned it again." So, but mostly I enjoy being out there. I mean, that's the goal for me, is just being out there. With as little weight as I can to enjoy the experience as much as I can.
And certainly, your book has reminded me you really enjoy the walking, literally dawn till dusk, as opposed to sort of camping earlier and having 4 or 5 hours watching the sun go down. It sounds like your preference is to walk the distance as opposed to walk between pretty campsites.
Yeah, definitely. I don't sit well. I tend to, the other thing is I don't typically pack for sitting around. I'm figuring for the coldest part of the day, I'm going to be in my sleeping bag. So I don't carry a big, heavy jacket, big, heavy hat, any kind of bottom insulation typically, because I'm not sitting around in the cold. I'm camping in the arid American West. So typically you're not around a campfire at night. So if you're sitting around either in the morning or the evening, it's going to be cold. And so you need extra clothes. And typically I don't have those extra clothes because I figure I'm either going to be walking or I'm going to be in my sleeping bag.
Sure. And going back to what you were just saying prior to that about preparing for a trip, everybody's got a different routine, but it sounds like you're possibly similar to me. I tend to sort of a week before I go, I start to get everything out and then move it up and down. And as you say, if I've got any notes, remind myself what I forgot or required the previous trip. But you started off by talking about cycle touring that you've been doing. So is there much of a different approach that you've got to that as well? Is there any particular area that's changed there for you from traditional panniers and going that way?
Well, yeah, that's been interesting. It came up recently that actually the cycle tour I did when I was 17 is still the longest adventure I've ever had. I cycled 4,200 miles. So what's that? I don't know, 7,000 kilometers across the United States, the big country, when I graduated high school. And, I had panniers. I did mail gear back at least once, maybe twice during that trip, as I kind of figured out what I didn't need and how little I could get by on. But then really didn't cycle tour again. And obviously been a part of and experienced and benefited from the revolution or evolution in backpacking gear, but hadn't really followed it in terms of cycling gear. So got a new bicycle, and that was a revelation because it looked nothing like the bicycle that I'd cycled across the country 50 years before or 45 years before. And so, packing for the cycling trip was interesting because the weight of the bags was so much more. I mean, I can throw everything in my Murmur pack, which weighs 220 grams, But on a bicycle, because I didn't want panniers, it was split up into a bunch of smaller bags, each of which, together they probably weigh 2 or 3 times the weight of my rucksack when I'm going backpacking. So that was interesting. And the other thing was how compact things were became an issue, because I had limited space that I wanted to use. And I didn't have a bunch of extra pockets, like on a rucksack, you can just throw extra stuff in the outside pockets. So it was a good challenge trying to modify my gear for ultralight cycle touring.
And did you manage to buy things off the shelf, or did you end up getting the sewing machine out again?
I mostly bought stuff off the shelf. I did make myself a frame bag to fit in the frame because I wanted every last centimeter of space. So I made it custom to fit my bicycle. I ended up sewing some custom lightweight bags that could go on the front fork. And then, of course, I designed the tent for the trip because that was something that I needed smaller and lighter than what I had.
And reflecting on that trip, what was the item or items that you feel that you actually should have taken or created to make it just that little bit more pleasurable?
I was surprised. Everything worked well. I mean, a couple of years later, we did another 700 kilometers on the Great Divide. And I think I changed very little. Everything worked fine.
Brilliant. Good. The other thing that I've noticed, obviously, as well, the last 10 years, I guess, the other areas of outdoor activities such as paddling, motorcycle camping is another one, I guess, and general traveling. Have you noticed that people from those different interests have also started to take on board that they don't need to bulk out everything that they carry with them at all?
Yeah, I have noticed that. I've seen motorcycle touring, and that always intrigues me, but I haven't done any of it. But we've done a fair amount of, Francie and I, my wife, have done a fair amount of like adventure travel overseas. And, that's an area where we see people in the airports with giant bags. And, I've discovered I can go with our vagabond. This is, I can go, I've been for 8 weeks in Europe, hiking all day, walking all day, going out to eat at nice restaurants at night, just in that. So, I think adventure travel is definitely an area that people could take less by applying some of the same principles. I mean, you don't have to worry about, typically, depending on how you're doing it, shelter, sleeping bags. So you've just got clothing to figure out. Clothing, first aid, some food, snacks, things like that. So, but you can apply the same principles to drastically reduce the amount of stuff you carry.
Sure. And just to give people an idea who are listening to this and perhaps not watching the video, that was what, about a 30-litre bag, was it?
That sounds about right, yeah.
Well, I mean, the book is full of little anecdotes and stories and interesting viewpoints, which I'm sure will help a lot of people interested in taking the next step, perhaps, and improving their enjoyment. Now, as I understand it, the profits of the book are all going to a particular organisation?
Yeah, I'm lucky to be blessed at the point in life where, a little additional income isn't going to make a difference in my lifestyle. We already give away a big chunk of our income. So, I decided to donate all profits from the book to the Pacific Crest Trail Association. The Pacific Crest Trail runs 2,650 miles. So what's it? 3,500 kilometers or so from Mexico to Canada across the entire western United States of California, Oregon, and Washington. So I've hiked a big chunk of it, most of it, and served on the board of the PCTA. So it just seemed a natural choice to, donate the profits to help them in their mission to preserve, protect, and promote a trail that is enjoyed by people from all over the world.
Fantastic. Yeah, I'm sure they greatly appreciate that. Well, a final question, Glenn. You have had this question before because I checked out our past conversation 11 years ago, and I know I asked it, so I'm going to ask it again. Of all the things I could have asked you about your new book, what should I have asked you?
Well, you could have asked me what people are getting out of it. What is the thing that, everyone's in a different place, and so they get something different out of the book. But the two things that keep coming up are one, the value of changing your perspective. And you've probably experienced this on trips or in life. I mean, you can tell two stories about probably any backpacking trip you take. It was terrible. There were bugs. We had to stream crossing, camping in the mud or whatever. Or there's probably also another true story you could tell about, oh, the sunset was amazing. And, we met those cool people from Germany and had a great conversation with them. Or, the beer we had in the pub afterwards was the best we ever had. And so, how you think about life, trips, and life in general depends on the story you tell. And we probably all know people that are hung up on the bad stories and can't see the good. But you can flip that story and, focus on the good and enjoy life a lot more, because everyone's life has good and bad in it. The other thing that people seem to be getting out of the book is I talk about generosity and how that can change your life and how to be more intentional with your generosity. And this started for us years and years ago. We started diverting in the beginning a small percentage of our income into a separate checking account. And then as needs come across our paths, we have money to address those. We don't have to respond to those only if we feel like we have money, because we have money. Now it's set aside just for helping out others. And it could be traditional charities that speak to you, or a friend just lost their job or needs money for cancer treatment, whatever the case may be. And I have, lots of stories of how we've been able to meet needs because we were intentional planning ahead, setting money aside. And that's something that a number of people have said spoke to them, and they have gone on to create, a separate checking account and fund that on a regular basis so that they have money to be more intentional in their giving.
My thanks to Glenn for taking the time to talk in detail about his experiences and share some of what he's learned. Of course, there is much more in the book, which is available in the UK and US on Amazon, in hard copy, Kindle and audiobook. Glenn has very generously given me 2 hard copies to give away in the US and 2 audiobooks for the UK. So to get your hands or ears on a copy, all you need to do is make sure that you follow my Instagram account, which is the_outdoors_station. Then click on the podcast post number 575 and leave a comment stating where you're located, your town and country. All entries will be put into a hat, and I'll contact the winners via Instagram for their details when it's drawn in a couple of weeks' time before the end of October. If you are new to backpacking and camping, it is a wealth of information and ideas. And if you're more experienced, it's a great reminder of things you may have forgotten. And that's it, folks. I hope you've enjoyed this conversation and some of the content. I'm just lining up my next interview, which I'll be recording later in this week, and that will be with you very soon. As always, folks, take care out there, and bye for now.
Thank you for listening to this podcast. To hear or see more from our extensive free library, please visit theoutdoorstation.co.uk.